I used to believe that the strongest men in New York walked into boardrooms with expensive watches and perfect smiles. Then one rainy Tuesday before sunrise, a stranger stepped into my bakery carrying nothing but silence, and somehow that silence changed everything. Every morning began at 3:30 a.m. for me, long before the city remembered it had another day to survive. While skyscrapers still slept beneath fading stars and yellow traffic lights blinked over nearly empty streets, I unlocked the front door of Bennett's Bakery with flour already dusting my jeans and cinnamon clinging to my sweater. My grandmother used to say bread could smell fear, so I never baked while worrying. Some mornings that advice was easier to follow than others. At 28, I wasn't the woman magazines wanted to photograph. I was plus size, always had been, with soft curves that no amount of early mornings or lifting 50-pound bags of flour had ever changed. For years, I tried to shrink myself to fit someone else's idea of beautiful. Then one day I realized customers never came back because of my waistline. They came back because the blueberry muffins reminded them of childhood and because someone behind the counter remembered their names. So I stopped apologizing for taking up space. The bakery became my whole world. The old brick walls carried the smell of butter that had soaked into them for decades. Wooden shelves displayed fresh sourdough beside glazed cinnamon rolls still warm from the oven. The espresso machine hissed like it had opinions about everything. Outside, Manhattan rushed toward another frantic day. Inside, time moved differently. Here, people smiled before checking their phones. Here, strangers wished each other good morning. Rain tapped softly against the windows as dawn struggled to brighten the street. I was arranging apple turnovers when the little brass bell above the door rang. I looked up automatically, expecting one of my regular construction workers grabbing breakfast before their shift. Instead, a man in a charcoal overcoat stepped inside. He was taller than almost everyone who visited the bakery, maybe 6'3", with dark hair damp from the rain, and calm blue eyes that somehow seemed older than the rest of him. His coat probably cost more than my monthly rent, yet he stood there quietly, studying the chalkboard menu as though he had nowhere else to be. "We're 5 minutes from fresh croissants," I said with a smile. "Unless you're willing to settle for yesterday's muffins." His lips curved into the smallest smile I'd ever seen. "I'll wait." His voice was low, steady, almost careful. I nodded and returned to brushing melted butter across golden pastry layers, but I could still feel his eyes drifting around the bakery, not staring at me, looking, really looking, at the family photographs on the wall, at the handwritten recipes framed beside the register, at the old wooden table where neighborhood kids decorated cookies every December. Most wealthy customers notice prices first. He noticed memories. Minutes passed without another word. The timer chimed. Warm air rushed from the oven carrying the rich scent of butter, vanilla, and fresh bread. I placed the first croissant onto a white plate and slid it across the counter. Steam curled into the cool morning air between us. He looked at the pastry, then back at me with an expression I couldn't quite understand, as though he'd been searching for something his entire life and had unexpectedly found the first clue inside a tiny neighborhood bakery before sunrise. He came back the next morning at exactly 5:12, just as the first streaks of sunrise painted the wet sidewalks gold. I noticed because my regulars rarely arrived that early unless they wore steel-toed boots or carried newspaper bags. He wore another perfectly tailored coat instead, the kind that looked untouched by the weather even though rain still lingered in the air. "Good morning," I said while dusting powdered sugar across a tray of fresh raspberry pastries. "You are early enough to catch the cinnamon rolls before everyone else steals them." A quiet smile appeared again. Then I suppose I chose the right time. There was something unusual about the way he spoke. Every word sounded measured, almost like someone who had spent years making decisions that could never be taken back. Yet standing inside my little bakery, he looked strangely comfortable. I poured him a cup of dark roast coffee without asking. "You seem like the kind of person who drinks it black." He looked down at the steaming mug before meeting my eyes. "Am I that predictable?" "No," I laughed. "Just tired." That earned a genuine smile, brief but unmistakably real. It softened the sharp lines of his face for a moment before disappearing again. "You read people well," he admitted. "Occupational hazard," I replied. "People tell you a lot before they ever speak." He glanced around the bakery once more, his attention lingering on an old photograph hanging beside the register. It showed my grandmother standing outside the shop nearly 40 years earlier, flour covering her apron while she laughed at someone standing behind the camera. "Your family?" he asked. "My grandmother started this place with almost nothing," I answered while arranging croissants into neat rows. "She believed every neighborhood deserved one place that smelled like fresh bread instead of stress." His eyes remained on the picture longer than I expected. She was right. Before I could answer, the bell above the door chimed repeatedly as the morning rush finally arrived. Construction workers filled the line. A young mother balancing a sleepy little girl ordered chocolate muffins. An older couple argued playfully over blueberry versus apple scones. Within seconds, the bakery transformed from peaceful silence into cheerful chaos. I moved from customer to customer, wrapping pastries, pouring coffee, laughing at familiar jokes, barely stopping to breathe. Somewhere in the middle of the rush, I noticed him quietly stepping aside instead of demanding faster service like so many wealthy customers often did. When an elderly man accidentally dropped his wallet near the door, the stranger bent down, picked it up, and returned it with nothing more than a polite nod. No performance, no expectation of praise, just kindness that almost nobody noticed. Almost nobody except me. Nearly 20 minutes later, the line finally disappeared. I leaned against the counter and exhaled. "Sorry about that." "Do not apologize," he said. "I enjoyed watching." I laughed again. "Watching people order too many pastries? Watching someone who loves what she does." His answer caught me off guard. Most people complimented the food. Nobody had ever complimented the way I worked. My cheeks warmed as I pretended to straighten a basket that did not need straightening. "Well," I said softly, "I think life is already difficult enough. If a warm cinnamon roll can make someone smile before 8 in the morning, then I have probably done something worthwhile." For several quiet seconds, he simply looked at me, not with curiosity anymore, but with something deeper that I could not name. Then he reached into his coat, placed enough cash on the counter to buy half the bakery, picked up only one croissant and 1 cup of coffee, and walked toward the door. "Sir," I called after him, "you gave me far too much." He paused with one hand on the door, but never turned around. "Keep the change," he said calmly. "I have a feeling I will be back tomorrow." By Friday morning, I knew his order before he reached the counter. 1 black coffee, 1 butter croissant, nothing else. I had started setting both aside around 5 o'clock without even realizing I was doing it. The strange part was not that he kept returning. It was that he never seemed to be in a hurry. Everyone in Manhattan rushed somewhere. They answered emails while standing in line. They glanced at expensive watches every 30 seconds. They apologized for having only 2 minutes to spare. But him? He sat beside the front window with his coffee cooling in his hands, watching the neighborhood wake up as though it was the most fascinating show in the world. "You should probably eat before your coffee gets cold," I teased one morning while wiping down the display case. He looked down at the untouched pastry and smiled faintly. "I always forget." "You forget to eat?" "Sometimes." I laughed. "That sounds unhealthy." "It probably is." There was honesty in that answer that caught me by surprise. Most successful people pretended to have perfect lives. He sounded like a man who had simply accepted that perfection did not exist. Over the next several days, we learned little pieces about each other. He told me he enjoyed quiet mornings because the city felt honest before sunrise. I admitted I secretly named every sourdough starter after old jazz musicians because it made the long baking hours less lonely. He actually laughed at that. A real laugh this time. Deep, warm, unexpected. It echoed softly through the bakery and made Mrs. Henderson, one of my oldest customers, glance over with an approving smile. After he left that morning, she leaned across the counter and whispered, "That handsome fellow looks at you like you are the first sunrise he has noticed in years." I nearly dropped the box of blueberry muffins I was packing. "He is just a regular customer." She raised one eyebrow. "Honey, I have been married for 52 years. I know the difference." I shook my head, laughing the comment away, but somehow those words stayed with me all afternoon. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond my little bakery, conversations I knew nothing about were beginning to unfold. Men who usually discussed business strategies suddenly found themselves wondering why Adrian Moretti insisted on disappearing every morning before sunrise. His schedule had always been precise. His decisions had always been predictable. Yet now he refused breakfast meetings and delayed conference calls until after 7. Nobody understood why. They only knew he returned every day carrying the unmistakable scent of fresh bread instead of expensive cologne. Back inside the bakery, none of that mattered. The only mystery I noticed was how someone dressed so elegantly could seem completely at ease sitting in an old wooden chair with crumbs on the table. One rainy morning, I caught him studying the chalk drawings neighborhood children had left on the sidewalk outside. Bright flowers, smiling suns, a crooked puppy with purple ears. They redraw them every Saturday, I explained as I handed him another cup of coffee. Rain washes them away every week. He remained silent for a moment before asking, "And they keep coming back?" "Of course. Even knowing it disappears?" I nodded. "That is the point. Some beautiful things are worth making again, even if they never last forever." His eyes lifted, slowly until they met mine. There was something different in them now. Not curiosity, not surprise, almost hope. He looked as though my simple answer had reached a place inside him that had been empty for a very long time. And for reasons I could not explain, my own heart suddenly forgot its comfortable rhythm. The following Monday arrived wrapped in bright autumn sunshine instead of rain. And for the first time in days, the bakery windows glowed with warm golden light instead of reflecting gray skies. I had barely finished placing fresh pecan sticky buns into the display when the little brass bell chimed. I looked up before I could stop myself. Somehow I already knew it was him. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound far more casual than I felt. "You are right on schedule." Adrian glanced toward the empty chair beside the window before looking back at me. "I suppose I have become predictable after all." "Only in the best way." The words escaped before I had time to think. I quickly busied myself filling his coffee cup while pretending I had not noticed the amused expression on his face. For a few peaceful minutes, neither of us spoke. The bakery smelled of maple syrup, fresh bread, and roasted coffee beans. Soft jazz drifted from the old speaker above the refrigerator. Outside, children hurried toward school holding oversized backpacks while office workers balanced paper cups and hurried across crosswalks. It felt like the entire neighborhood was breathing together. Adrian finally broke the silence. "Do you ever leave this place?" I laughed quietly. "That sounds worse than it is." It was a genuine question. I leaned against the counter, folding my flour-covered apron between my hands. "Sometimes. Sunday afternoons if I finish early. I visit my grandmother's garden outside the city. Other than that, this bakery keeps me busy." He nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. "Then perhaps you should let someone else make breakfast for you one morning." I blinked. "Is that an invitation?" "Yes." His answer was calm, direct, without the slightest trace of arrogance. "There is a small cafe overlooking the Hudson. The sunrise is beautiful there." I smiled despite myself, touched that he had actually thought about a place I might enjoy instead of somewhere expensive or impressive. Still, I shook my head gently. "That sounds lovely, but I cannot." He did not look offended, only curious. "Because you do not know me?" "Partly." I smiled apologetically. "Mostly because every morning I am already here before almost everyone else wakes up. If I skip one morning, dozens of people skip breakfast." He looked around the bakery as though seeing it differently for the first time. The elderly couple sharing one cinnamon roll. The police officer grabbing coffee before his shift. The college student studying beside the window with a muffin and worn textbooks. "You think they need you?" "No," I answered softly. "I think we all need somebody who shows up." The words settled quietly between us. He lowered his eyes to his coffee, turning the warm cup slowly in his hands. "Very few people have ever shown up for me," he admitted almost under his breath. I was not sure he intended for me to hear it. My heart tightened before I could stop it. "Then I am sorry," I said. He looked up immediately, surprised by the sincerity in my voice. Everyone deserves one place where somebody is happy to see them walk through the door. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The noise of the bakery faded into the background until it felt as though only the two of us remained. Finally, he stood, placed enough cash on the counter to cover his breakfast several times over, and reached for his coat. "Perhaps one day," he said quietly, "you will let someone show up for you instead." Before I could answer, the bell chimed again as new customers filled the bakery, and by the time I looked back toward the door, he had already disappeared into the bright Manhattan morning, leaving behind only the fading aroma of coffee, fresh bread, and a question I could not stop asking myself for the rest of the day. Wednesday morning began with an unfamiliar silence. The neighborhood still smelled of fresh rain and fallen leaves, but something felt different before I even unlocked the bakery door. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was simply one of those mornings when the air seemed to be waiting for something. I switched on the lights, tied my apron, and started kneading the first batch of sourdough while soft jazz floated through the empty room. The familiar rhythm usually settled my thoughts, but not that morning. At exactly 5:12, the little brass bell rang. Adrian stepped inside, carrying the cool autumn air with him, his dark overcoat neatly buttoned, his expression as calm as ever. "Good morning," I said, smiling despite the strange feeling lingering in my chest. "I was beginning to think you finally decided to sleep in." "I considered it," he answered, removing his gloves. Then I remembered the croissants. I laughed and placed one onto his favorite white plate before he even reached the counter. "I am starting to worry that you only come here for the pastries." That would be the easier explanation. His answer lingered between us longer than either of us expected. Before I could think of a response, the front door opened again. 3 sharply dressed men entered together, each wearing expensive suits that seemed oddly out of place in my cozy little bakery. They looked around the room with quiet attention before one of them approached Adrian. "Sir," the oldest of them said respectfully, "they are waiting." Adrian barely glanced at him. "They can wait a little longer." The 3 men exchanged brief looks, but said nothing else. They stepped outside again without another word, leaving the bakery almost as quickly as they had entered. I stared after them before looking back at Adrian. "Friends from work?" I asked lightly. He paused just long enough for me to notice. "Something like that." I nodded without pressing further. Everyone had parts of their lives they preferred to keep private. I respected that. The morning rush soon arrived, filling every table with familiar faces. Children laughed over oversized cinnamon rolls while neighbors caught up over coffee. In the middle of the cheerful noise, I noticed Adrian watching the room again, but this time his attention was not on me. It was on everyone else. The exhausted nurse finally smiling after her first sip of coffee. The retired teacher slipping $5 into the community tip jar for a struggling college student. The young father carefully cutting a muffin into tiny pieces for his toddler. He watched them with quiet fascination, almost as if he had forgotten ordinary mornings like these even existed. As the crowd slowly thinned, I carried a fresh slice of warm apple pie to his table. "This one is on the house." He looked surprised. "Why?" "Because everybody deserves dessert once in a while." He smiled softly. "You have an interesting way of measuring wealth." I shrugged. "Some people count dollars. I count reasons to come back tomorrow." He lowered his eyes to the pie before speaking again. "And if someone had everything except that?" I leaned against the chair across from him. "Then they do not actually have everything." He held my gaze for several quiet seconds. Outside, one of the suited men glanced through the bakery window before respectfully looking away again. I still did not realize they were watching over one of the most powerful men in the city. To me, Adrian was simply the customer who always forgot to eat his croissant while it was still warm. But as he quietly folded the bakery napkin and slipped it into his coat pocket instead of leaving it behind, I had the unmistakable feeling that this little place had somehow become far more important to him than either of us was ready to admit. The first crack in the peaceful little world I had built came on a Friday afternoon, not before sunrise like everything important usually seemed to happen. The lunch crowd had finally disappeared, leaving behind empty coffee cups, scattered crumbs, and the comforting scent of fresh sourdough cooling on wooden racks. I was wiping flour from the front counter when the bell above the door rang with an unfamiliar urgency. A young woman stepped inside carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than every chair in my bakery combined. She looked around carefully before approaching me with a warm but strangely nervous smile. "Are you Grace Bennett?" she asked. "That is me." She reached into her leather folder and placed a business card on the counter. The company name belonged to one of the largest hospitality groups in New York. "Our client would like to invest in your bakery." I blinked in confusion. I never applied for investors. This would be a private offer. She slid a folder toward me. "Complete renovation. New equipment. Additional locations if you choose. Full financial support while you remain sole owner." I opened the folder and immediately closed it again after seeing numbers that made absolutely no sense. It was enough money to erase every loan I had ever carried and secure the bakery for decades. "There has to be a mistake," I said quietly. "No mistake." She smiled politely. Our client believes your bakery deserves to reach more people. Who is your client? For the first time, she hesitated. I am not authorized to share that information. I gently pushed the folder back across the counter. Then I cannot accept it. Her expression softened with genuine surprise. May I ask why? I looked around the bakery. The worn wooden shelves built by my grandfather. The tiny scratch on the counter where I had accidentally dropped my first mixing bowl at 19. The faded family photographs hanging beside the register. Because this place was never supposed to become an empire, I answered. It was only supposed to become home. She studied me for a long moment before quietly gathering the papers. Very few people turn down opportunities like this. I smiled. Maybe I already have what I wanted. After she left, I stood alone in the silent bakery wondering who in the world would make such an offer to someone like me. My first thought was that it had to be a misunderstanding. My second thought arrived the following morning at exactly 5:12. Adrian walked in carrying the familiar scent of cool autumn air. One look at my face, and he immediately knew something was different. You seem distracted, he observed. I poured his coffee without answering right away. Someone tried to buy my future yesterday. His hand paused halfway toward the cup. Did they? I nodded. A mysterious investor. I laughed softly, although it sounded uncertain even to me. They offered enough money to change my life. And what did you say? I placed his warm croissant beside the coffee before meeting his eyes. I said, no. He looked genuinely surprised. Without thinking about it. I did think about it. I smiled. For almost 30 seconds. For the first time since I had met him, he seemed unable to find the right words. Finally he asked, almost carefully, what if accepting it could have made your life easier? I folded my flour-covered hands together and glanced around the bakery once more. Easy is not always the same as happy. Silence settled gently between us. Outside the window, the city hurried through another busy morning without noticing anything unusual. Inside, Adrian lowered his eyes toward the untouched croissant and quietly smiled to himself, as though my answer had somehow undone a belief he had carried for far too many years. The answer should have reached me sooner than it did. Looking back now, all the clues had been sitting right in front of me like fresh bread cooling on the rack. The expensive watches he never seemed to notice. The tailored coats that fit too perfectly. The respectful men who appeared whenever he did and disappeared just as quietly. Even the mysterious investment offer that vanished the moment I refused it. Yet I kept telling myself there had to be an ordinary explanation because ordinary explanations made life easier. That illusion lasted until the following Tuesday. I had closed the bakery for my weekly afternoon supply run at the farmer's market across the river. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of apples, roasted pecans, and fresh flowers as neighbors wandered between colorful stands. I loved coming here because nobody cared about appearances. Farmers judged people by how they treated others, not by the clothes they wore or the cars they drove. I had just finished choosing a basket of Honeycrisp apples when I noticed a familiar figure several booths away. Adrian stood speaking quietly with an elderly vendor who sold homemade jams every weekend. There were no dark coats around him, no polished shoes clicking across marble floors. He was simply helping the old man lift heavy wooden crates onto a folding table. When he spotted me, genuine surprise crossed his face. Grace, I did not know you shopped here. He smiled softly. There are still a few places where people remember my grandfather. Before I could ask what he meant, the elderly vendor looked at me with bright, cheerful eyes. You must be the baker. I laughed politely. Is it that obvious? He has not stopped talking about your bread for weeks. My cheeks warmed immediately. Adrian looked almost embarrassed, which somehow seemed impossible for a man who always appeared perfectly composed. Frank, he said quietly, you are not helping. The old man chuckled. You know, young lady, this fellow never recommends restaurants, never talks about vacations, and certainly never praises pastries. Then suddenly, every Saturday, he starts buying my apple preserves because they pair well with your sourdough. Adrian rubbed the back of his neck, looking almost uncomfortable. I could not help smiling. I did not realize I had become part of your breakfast routine. Apparently you have, Frank answered before Adrian could. We all laughed together, and for a few precious minutes the world felt wonderfully simple. Then everything changed without anyone raising their voice. A sleek black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly to the curb nearby. Two men stepped out, both wearing dark suits. They did not hurry. They simply approached Adrian with quiet respect. One leaned close enough to speak privately. I could not hear every word, only a single sentence carried by the breeze. "The council is waiting for you, Mr. Moretti." My smile faded. Mr. Moretti. The name sounded strangely familiar. Before I could place it, another shopper walking past suddenly stopped, stared toward Adrian for only a heartbeat, then gently guided his family in the opposite direction without saying a word. It was not fear exactly. It was recognition, the kind that changes the way a room breathes. Adrian looked back at me, and for the first time since we had met, I saw genuine hesitation in his eyes. "Grace," he said quietly, "there are some things I should have told you sooner." I looked from him to the waiting vehicle, then back again. Every small mystery from the past several weeks suddenly lined up inside my mind like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their place. I had not yet learned the whole truth, but deep inside I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The man who never forgot to visit my little bakery every morning was not simply another customer, and whatever life he had been protecting me from had just stepped into the daylight. I could have asked him 100 questions that afternoon, but the only one that escaped my lips was the simplest. "Who are you?" The farmer's market suddenly felt much quieter than it had only moments before. Families continued sampling apples. Children laughed near the pumpkin stand. Somewhere a musician played an old jazz tune on his guitar. The world had not changed. Only mine had. Adrian looked at the two men waiting beside the black sport utility vehicle before turning back to me. "I owe you the truth," he said quietly. "All of it." We walked away from the crowd until we reached a small wooden bench overlooking the river. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves across the water. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he took a slow breath. "My family built a business many years ago. Some parts of it are respectable. Some parts are far more complicated." I studied his face carefully. He was not trying to impress me. He was trying to be honest. "People know your name?" I said softly. "Yes. Enough to move away when they recognize you." His eyes lowered toward the ground. "Yes." I wrapped both hands around the warm cup of cider I had bought only minutes earlier. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because the only version of me that mattered inside your bakery was the man drinking black coffee and forgetting to eat his croissant while it was still warm." His answer hurt far more than I expected because I knew he believed it. "You made that choice for me," I whispered. "I know." There was no excuse in his voice, only regret. "I was afraid that if you knew my name before you knew my heart, you would never give me the chance to show you who I wanted to become." I closed my eyes for a second, remembering every quiet morning we had shared, every conversation about bread, families, ordinary happiness, and showing up for people. None of those moments had been fake. Yet they had not been complete either. "Did you send the investment offer?" I asked. He nodded once. "When I saw how hard you worked, I wanted to make your life easier." I could not help smiling sadly. "You still thought money was the answer." "I did." He looked at me with complete honesty. "Until you refused it." I laughed quietly despite everything. "You really do not understand bakers. Teach me." The words came so naturally that they almost stole my breath. There was no command in his voice. No expectation, only a simple request. I looked out across the river where sunlight shimmered over the water like scattered pieces of glass. "A loaf of bread rises because someone is patient enough to wait," I said. "You cannot rush it. You cannot force it. If you try, you ruin the whole thing." Adrian listened without interrupting. "People are not much different. Trust needs time. Kindness needs repetition. Home needs ordinary mornings." He nodded slowly, as though committing every word to memory. "Then I have been trying to solve everything the wrong way." "Maybe not everything." I smiled gently. "You kept coming back every morning." That part was right. For the first time since revealing the truth, genuine relief softened his expression. The weight he had carried for weeks seemed just a little lighter. As we stood to leave, he stopped beside the bench instead of walking toward the waiting vehicle. "Grace," he said quietly, "if knowing who I am changes everything, I will understand." I looked into the calm blue eyes that had first met mine across a bakery counter before sunrise and realized something important. His name had become larger that afternoon, but the man who remembered my grandmother's photograph, smiled at children's sidewalk drawings, and believed fresh bread could heal a difficult morning was exactly the same person I had already come to know. The next morning I unlocked the bakery at 3:30 as always, half expecting everything to feel different. The oven still warmed the room with familiar comfort. Flowers still floated through the air like tiny snowflakes caught in golden light. The old espresso machine still complained before finally doing its job. Some things, I realized, refused to change no matter how complicated life became. By 5 o'clock, the first loaves rested on the cooling racks, filling every corner with the rich scent of butter and fresh bread. I found myself glancing toward the front door more often than I wanted to admit. 5:10, 5:11, 5:12. The little brass bell finally rang. Adrian stepped inside alone. No black sport utility vehicle waited outside. No men in tailored suits stood nearby. He wore a simple navy sweater beneath a dark jacket instead of one of his expensive overcoats, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked almost uncertain. "Good morning," he said quietly. I smiled before I could stop myself. "You are 2 minutes late." He looked at the clock above the pastry case and gave a small, apologetic laugh. "I suppose I am." I placed a warm croissant and a cup of black coffee on the counter without asking. Some routines are worth keeping. He looked at the breakfast, then back at me. "Even after yesterday?" "Especially after yesterday." He let out a slow breath, as though he had been carrying it all night. The bakery remained empty except for the two of us. Outside, the sky slowly shifted from deep blue to pale orange as another Manhattan morning prepared to begin. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and carefully placed a folded envelope on the counter. "What is this?" I asked. "The investment proposal." I looked at him with surprise. "I thought that was finished." "It is." He gently pushed the envelope closer to me. "I withdrew it this morning." I frowned slightly. Without asking whether I had changed my mind, he smiled. "Because I finally understood that it was never my decision to make." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I picked up the envelope, tore it in half, and dropped it into the recycling bin beneath the counter. We both laughed, the quiet kind that comes from shared understanding instead of perfect jokes. As the first customers began arriving, something unexpected happened. Adrian stood and walked behind the counter. "May I help?" I raised one eyebrow. "Can you?" "Probably not." "That is the correct answer." Mrs. Henderson walked in just in time to see him awkwardly trying to fold a bakery box. She smiled knowingly. "Well now, that is a sight I never expected." Adrian looked down at the crooked box in his hands. "I believe I require additional training." "Definitely," I replied, laughing. "You fold boxes about as well as you eat warm croissants." The morning passed with laughter, spilled flour, crooked pastry boxes, and conversations that felt wonderfully ordinary. Nobody inside the bakery cared how much influence Adrian carried outside those walls. Here he was simply another person learning that some things could not be mastered in a single morning. As the breakfast rush finally settled, he looked around the bakery one more time. The family photographs, the neighborhood regulars, the sunlight spilling across the wooden tables. Then he looked at me. "I spent years believing power meant making people follow me," he said softly. "You taught me that real strength is showing up where you are needed, even when nobody is watching." I reached across the counter and brushed a little flour from the sleeve of his sweater. "And you reminded me that people are more than the stories others tell about them." Outside, the city continued racing toward another busy day. Inside, the scent of fresh bread wrapped around us like home. Looking back now, I understand why he kept returning before sunrise. It was never just about the coffee. It was never just about the pastries. Sometimes the richest person in the room is simply the one who finally finds a place where nothing has to be purchased to feel priceless. And every morning, when the little brass bell still rings at exactly 5:12, I smile before I even look up, because some recipes are measured in butter and flour, while the most unforgettable ones are measured in trust, kindness, and the quiet decision to keep coming back.